Welcome to the Crypto Layer HQ. Today I will be going over what Bitcoin is potentially telling us about the altcoin market, and I will be going over major altcoins such as Ethereum, Solana, and XRP. So I think it's useful to look at the altcoins against their Bitcoin pairs. So for example, Ethereum against Bitcoin, we can see that the highs were around 0.08 and the lows were around 0.017. And we can see oftentimes we do end up testing these levels of either twice or more. So for example, if this time we did end up retesting this lower level, that would be a 38% drawdown from here, assuming Bitcoin stays at the same price of 68K. So this is a more optimistic scenario potentially, since we could expect to see more downside with Bitcoin. But let's assume Bitcoin is still trading at 68K and ETH BTC eventually retests its bottom level against Bitcoin. What would that mean for Ethereum? So we can see from here, that would be about a 38% drawdown. So if we look at Ethereum, assuming a 38% drawdown from here, that would take us to about 1.2K. So I think 1.2K is potentially a good target, potentially optimistic target, more bullish potentially, since there's a good chance Bitcoin will continue lower. And if Bitcoin does continue lower, for example, let's say it does end up going to 50K, then ETH will need to drop even more for ETH Bitcoin to end up retesting this level. And let's assume, for example, Bitcoin were to retest this, for example, 50K, that would be a 26% drawdown. And that would mean for ETH BTC to reach the lower level, instead of dropping 38%, it would need to, instead of 38%, we need to increase 38% by 26%, since Bitcoin to 50K would be another 26% drop. And that would be approximately a 48% drawdown in Ethereum. So that would take us to these levels. So around 1K, for example. So which would be retesting these lows we had back in June 2022. So potentially 1K to 1.2K could be a reasonable level to end up retesting with Ethereum, assuming ETH BTC does end up retesting this low and Bitcoin holds steady or ends up dropping a bit lower. Next up is Solana. So if we look at Solana BTC, we can see there's this very clear pattern of testing these highs and then these lows and now these highs again. And potentially we're going to end up testing these lows. And that would mean a 70% drawdown from here. So assuming Bitcoin does stay at 68K and we get a 70% drawdown against Bitcoin, that would mean from these levels, Solana would reach about $25. So we can mark that down, and that's potentially, which would be a very key level. If we look back in the bear market in 2022 and 2023, we can see 25K was a very key level where it bounced off here, bounced again, eventually broke down, and then it acted as resistance several times before we eventually broke out. So $25 could be a very realistic target. Of course, if Bitcoin ends up going lower and Solana BTC does end up retesting these lows, then it could go even lower. Next up is XRP. If we look at XRP against Bitcoin, we can see something similar, that we, for the last 6 years, we usually test these levels and then fail and then eventually test the support. And we can see even here, we ended up double testing it and then eventually going back up here and then failing. And now we're starting to fade again. So we are probably going to end up testing these lower levels again. And if we were to do that, that would be a 68% drawdown for XRP, again, assuming Bitcoin stays at 68K. So this is also a more optimistic scenario. So 68% drawdown would mean XRP going to back to 45 cents, and that would be here. So that would be, again, back to a very long and big base we built back in 2024 and even 2023, where it acted as support many times. So we might end up retesting this level here. So pretty much where it's always ended up consolidating in bear markets is where we would end up going. significantly lower if Bitcoin does end up breaking down and going to the 40s, and Solana BTC still ends up going to the lows, and XRP BTC ends up going to these lows, and the same thing with Ethereum BTC end up going to these lows. So I do expect in 2026, maybe even 2027, we do end up retesting these lower bands for alt Bitcoin pairs. And that's why Bitcoin is definitely king of the crypto market. And especially in bear markets, you do suffer a lot less downside than altcoins. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out.